The first light over the English Channel arrived without warmth, a thin strip of silver pushing through the kind of cold that bit into metal and bone alike. It was the hour when bomber crews felt the weight of the day before it had even begun, the moment when the engines were loud enough to shake the air, but not loud enough to drown out the quiet questions every man carried. Inside B-17F The Spirit of 76, the temperature had already dropped far below freezing. Frost clung to the oxygen lines, vibration rolled through the fuselage in a steady, numbing rhythm, and the smell of oil and cold aluminum filled every breath. At 20,000 feet, nothing felt alive except the aircraft's 4 engines and the men who depended on them. This mission had seemed routine on paper, another strike deep into occupied France, but routine vanished the moment the bomber stream hit the coastline. Radar reports had been right. The Luftwaffe was awake, regrouped and climbing. Maynard Snuffy Smith, waist gunner, new to combat, small in stature but known for a stubborn kind of grit, understood instantly what the shifting formation meant. On the horizon, tiny specks carved upward against the pale sky, fighters, too many to count at first glance, and closing. A cold open moment unfolded in real time. The moisture on the inside of his glass froze, then cracked in a spiderweb pattern as the B-17 bounced through turbulence. The intercom hissed. The bomber commander tried to keep the crew tight, but rising engine RPM and the distortion of thin air made every word feel like it was coming from underwater. Smith tightened his gloves around the handles of the 50 caliber machine gun as the tail gunner called out the first definitive sighting. 12 fighters, diving in staggered pairs, sun behind them, exploiting every tactical advantage the altitude offered. Their silhouettes sharpened, Messerschmitt Bf 109 Sev and Focke-Wulf Furf 190s, the Luftwaffe's fastest killers. Within seconds the sky transformed. The silence became a storm. The first pass hit the bomber formation like a hammer. Tracers arced in long diagonal lines and aluminum skins peeled away under cannon fire. The sky was suddenly filled with debris, black flakes from ruptured engines, charred fragments floating like ashes in a high-altitude wind. Smith felt the ship vibrate harder as the Spirit of 76 dipped out of tight formation. Every bomber relied on the interlocking arcs of 11 other aircraft. Sliding even a few degrees off position created blind corners that enemy fighters could exploit. And this was exactly the moment the first 109 made its move. Its engine howl cut through the gunner's compartment an instant before it appeared. Fast, too fast, the attack angle steep, dive flaps screaming. The BSEF 109 opened fire at 50 yards, cannon shells walking across the fuselage from nose to tail. The first explosions came near the radio room, the second detonated behind Smith's compartment, blowing open the rear bulkhead and throwing the internal temperature into a brutal plunge. Shrapnel punched across the interior. The bomber shook violently. A fire erupted near the ammunition boxes. For a heartbeat, Smith thought the tail section might tear away entirely. Then came the shock that changed everything. 3 crewmen bailed out. Smith saw their parachutes vanish downward into the clouds, their shapes swallowed by altitude and wind. Smoke filled the interior so quickly the oxygen mask tasted of ash. Another explosion rocked the left wing. A burst of flame reached over the waist window like a hand trying to pull him out. Smith understood in that single ice-bright moment that the aircraft was now nearly defenseless, alone, burning, wounded and falling behind the formation, and the 12 fighters were circling back. The cold open sharpened into a suffocating truth. He was almost the only man left standing between the bomber and its destruction. The Luftwaffe pilots saw the isolated B-17 and adjusted their attack patterns. Instead of quick passes, they slowed their approaches, coming head-on, tail-on, crosswise, testing angles, plotting weaknesses. Vapor trails curved into tight spirals as they repositioned in the sun. Smith swung the .50 caliber gun mount hard, metal scraping, ammo belts rattling like chains. Every movement felt heavier than the last, the freezing air stiffening the joints, the rising heat from the spreading fire creating sharp waves of distortion. His field of vision narrowed until all he could see were moving black shapes and the faint glint of wings. The next attack came from low 6 o'clock. Smith held fire, then another, and another. The value delivered every 30 seconds was simple and brutal. The fighters were adapting. He would have to adapt faster. As the burning bomber drifted further from the group, he adjusted his stance, braced his shoulder and waited until the enemy was close enough that the muzzle flash reflected off their canopies. Then he fired. Long, controlled bursts, not desperate, not wasted, cutting through the cold sky with a mechanical violence that pushed the gun mount backward each time. Tracers linked the space between aircraft like glowing wires. One enemy fighter broke off sharply, smoke trailing behind it. The fire behind him grew. Ammunition cooked off. Oxygen hissed through ruptured lines. The bomber dropped altitude again. And yet, Smith stayed at his station. The man who had never been expected to stand out was now shaping the fate of a B-17 engulfed in smoke and hunted by 12 aircraft trained to tear heavy bombers apart. The storm had fully arrived. The battle had begun. And the waist gunner, who was supposed to be the least significant man on the crew, was now the only line between survival and oblivion. The events that unfolded inside the burning fuselage of the Spirit of 76 did not emerge from chaos alone. They were the inevitable intersection of American strategic pressure, German desperation, and the unforgiving mathematics of daylight precision bombing. To understand why a single waist gunner would end up nearly alone against 12 fighters, the world around him must be reconstructed. The world that built the mission, shaped the aircraft, and produced the collision that now hung in the sky somewhere between England and occupied France. For the United States, this phase of the air war was defined by conviction. The 8th Air Force believed that daylight bombing, executed with precision instruments and disciplined formations, could dismantle German industry faster than the Luftwaffe could protect it. At the center of this doctrine stood the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a machine designed to project force far beyond the range of ground-based artillery, built around the idea that overlapping fields of defensive fire could overcome any fighter attack. But reality had a way of rewriting theory. By this point in the war, the Luftwaffe was adjusting, shifting tactics with brutal efficiency. Fighter Gruppen were instructed to focus attacks on lagging or isolated bombers, knowing that the moment a B-17 dropped out of formation, its defensive perimeter collapsed. And the German pilots knew exactly where a wounded bomber would fall. Altitude loss meant reduced speed, thinner protection, and blind angles waiting to be exploited. This was the environment in which Maynard Snuffy Smith entered the war. Smith had not been a natural fit for military life. He wasn't a towering figure or a charismatic presence. He was small, stubborn, sharp-edged in temperament, and often underestimated by those around him. The Army Air Forces expected little from him beyond functional competence. Yet combat has a way of elevating the unexpected, especially when the structure around a man begins to break. His position, waist gunner, was one of the least glamorous aboard the B-17. No bomb release decisions, no navigation, no control over engines or altitude. His job was simple in description and brutal in execution: hold the narrow corridor of the fuselage against anything that approached from the sides or rear. He controlled a pair of .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns that were effective but limited by angle and field of fire. In a perfect formation, his overlapping arcs protected the bombers beside him. Alone, they were simply two guns against a continent of sky. The Spirit of 76 itself had already flown multiple missions. The bomber was known less for its technical perfection and more for its crew's cohesion. They understood the risks of deep penetration missions, especially at high altitudes where oxygen failures, engine overheating, and structural strain were daily threats. Yet it was the presence of heavy German fighter response that shaped the decisions at every level, from mission planning to mid-air maneuvers. On the ground, intelligence analysts had warned of increased Luftwaffe readiness. Intercepts suggested that Jagdgeschwader units were reorganizing, combining veteran pilots with younger replacements eager to prove themselves. The German aircraft involved, the Bf-109 and F-190, were among the most advanced fighters of their era. Fast, armed with 20 mm and 30 mm cannons, and capable of steep diving attacks, they were designed precisely for the kind of interception the Americans were conducting that day. The American response had been to tighten formations, adjust routes, and trust that massed firepower would offset numerical disadvantage. That trust worked, until it didn't. When bombers took damage, fell out of formation, or suffered internal failures, the doctrine unraveled. The Luftwaffe trained specifically to exploit such vulnerabilities, attacking from blind angles and forcing choices the bomber crews could not afford. This was exactly the position the Spirit of 76 was in when the first fighters struck it. A wounded aircraft, a drifting trajectory, internal fires spreading through the fuselage, everything the German pilots waited for. Smith's circumstances grew more severe with each passing second. The fire near the ammunition crates was a direct threat not only to the bomber's structural integrity but to the gunner's ability to maneuver. The heat warped the surrounding metal, changing how the gun mount responded to pressure. Smoke altered visibility. Every burst of cannon fire from an approaching fighter added new fractures and new points of instability along the fuselage. What was remarkable, even in this early stage of the engagement, was not simply that Smith continued to fight, but that he understood the geometry of the moment. He shifted his stance to anticipate enemy approach vectors, using the bomber's slight listing to align his angles. He minimized wasted fire. He conserved ammunition with the kind of discipline learned not from training manuals but from instinct and the immediate necessity of survival. Outside, the Luftwaffe pilots regrouped, adjusting their tactics around the aircraft's degraded performance. They formed loose attack rotations, flying in pairs using altitude separation to confuse defensive sightlines. Their intentions were clear: force the bomber into a terminal dive, peel the crew out of the sky, and finish what the damage had begun. This was the world that shaped the moment now unfolding, a war of industrial doctrine, mathematical precision, and personal willpower converging inside a burning aircraft over occupied Europe. Every factor that had driven the mission into the sky was now bearing down on a single man holding 2 machine guns and a shrinking perimeter of control. The wider war had narrowed to the width of a fuselage. The coming minutes would determine whether the Spirit of 76 remained airborne or became another piece of wreckage scattered across the French countryside. The German fighters did not reappear all at once. They returned in calculated fragments, a black dot rising through haze, a pair of glints sliding in from sunlit angles, the brief flash of a diving shape stitching contrails through the cold. Each approach was deliberate, measured, and coordinated, like pieces in a tightening vise. The Luftwaffe pilots had seen the B-17 drop out of formation. They had seen the fire. They had seen the parachutes. And they understood exactly what those signs meant. A wounded heavy bomber, a drifting target, limited guns still active, a kill waiting to be completed. For Maynard Snuffy Smith, the silence between these approaches was worse than the attacks. It was the stillness of a battlefield taking a deep breath, the kind of quiet that thrummed against the inside of his lungs, growing heavier with each second. The bomber's interior was now a landscape of heat and frost. Flames licked upward along the right side of the fuselage, the oxygen lines hissed with escaping vapors, and the metal floor radiated an uneven warmth from burning insulation beneath. Smoke curled in thin, dark layers, like drifting fog over a road after a storm. Yet outside, the air temperature remained well below freezing, so every crack or puncture in the metal skin sent stabbing cold across his exposed wrists. He braced himself against the window frame, his gloves sticking briefly to the frost-covered metal. The Browning .50 caliber machine gun waited in front of him, its barrel already hot from the initial bursts. The ammunition belt fed in a long, rattling chain that felt impossibly short now that 12 fighters were converging. The first confirmed attack of the second wave came from above. A Bf-109 dropped into view, its radiator scoops glowing faintly as sunlight hit the metal. The nose-mounted cannon fired short, tight bursts that sparked across the bomber's upper fuselage. One of the shells punched through near the dorsal turret, sending fragments cascading into the waist section like a hail of hot coins. Smith didn't fire yet. He watched the fighter's angle, the timing of its dive, the moment when the nose dipped fractionally too far into the attack run. The German pilot committed, a split-second decision that narrowed his room to maneuver. Smith waited another heartbeat, then pressed the trigger. The .50 caliber roared. The recoil felt like a living force, pushing against his shoulder in rhythmic jolts. Tracers burned a clean line across the sky, merging with the fighter's dive path. The pilot tried to roll out, too late. Smith saw a brief spark where a wing root met the fuselage, then a smoke trail, thin at first, then wide enough to smear the fighter's silhouette. The aircraft spiraled, dropped below the bomber's altitude, and vanished into the cloud layer, one down. But the next wave was already coming. 2 Fajr 190s attacked from opposite sides, a classic pincer strike meant to split a gunner's attention. Their radial engines produced a deeper, throatier sound than the 109s, and the cannon fire they delivered shook the bomber with heavier impacts. Smith shifted to meet the left-hand attacker, firing short bursts to walk his tracers into position. He felt the side of the fuselage jolt as cannon shells struck the opposite side, the fire behind him flaring brighter. For a moment the bomber's interior became a furnace. Heat blasted across his legs, distorting his vision. Ammunition inside the storage boxes began to pop, single rounds cooking off, sounding like small metallic claps. The firelight flickered against the aluminum skin, creating dancing patterns that made the smoke seem alive. Still, he kept firing. The Luftwaffe 190 broke away, its pilot unwilling to take more punishment. The right-hand attacker pressed harder, diving in low, aiming for the tail. Smith pivoted, dragging the heavy gun mount across the floor with a sharp metal grind. He fired again, the tracers rising like a glowing arc. One round struck the fighter's cowling, another hit the outer wing, and the pilot yanked the stick, climbing sharply to abort the pass. Smith exhaled, a long controlled breath that fogged his mask from the inside. But the sky offered no rest. 3 more fighters entered from the bomber's dead rear angle. The tail gun had fallen silent. Smoke, fire, and structural damage had cut off communication to the back of the aircraft. Smith had to judge the incoming angles by sound and shadow alone. He repositioned without hesitation. Oxygen canisters burst behind him as the fire reached their casings, sending concussive blasts through the fuselage strong enough to rattle his teeth. The bomber's tail section flexed visibly through the smoke, a skeletal silhouette bending under stress. Yet the fighters kept coming, adapting to the aircraft's damaged posture, exploiting the wounded arcs where guns no longer functioned. This was the moment where the engagement shifted from organized interception to a chaotic, desperate duel between one man and an entire attack formation. The next fighter came head-on from the left at high speed. Smith fired early, creating a curtain of tracers the pilot was forced to fly through. The fighter flinched, a tiny instinctive correction, and that was enough. Smith adjusted, firing a second burst that caught the underside of the wing. The German aircraft rolled violently, losing altitude in an uncontrolled slip. Another down, or at least out of the fight. The remaining fighters circled outside of immediate range, reassessing. Smith used the brief lull to stamp at burning insulation, pushing debris away from the ammunition crates. The heat was unbearable now, stinging through his flight suit. He ripped off a section of smoldering fabric and threw it aside, ignoring the sparks that jumped onto his gloves. His world had narrowed to 2 tasks: keep the guns firing, and keep the fire from killing him first. Outside, the German fighters formed another attack line. Their next approach would be coordinated, decisive, and likely overwhelming. Smith's breathing slowed, his hands tightened around the gun grips. The bomber creaked and moaned like a ship taking on water. The first contact phase was over. The next would decide everything. The next wave did not come in scattered fragments or probing angles. It came as a synchronized wall of intent. 4 fighters diving in from above, 3 rising from below, and the last 2 sliding in at oblique angles, designed to collapse every remaining defensive arc of the wounded bomber. It was the kind of formation reserved for finishing blows, the kind intended to erase a single straggling aircraft from the sky with overwhelming pressure. Inside the Spirit of 76, Maynard Snuffy Smith felt the shift before he saw it. The vibration in the fuselage changed. The fire behind him intensified with a sharp upward flare. The bomber's left wing dipped, dragging the aircraft down a shallow, uncontrolled descent. The altitude loss brought thicker air, but at the cost of speed, and slower bombers died faster. He knew what this meant. The Luftwaffe was preparing to close the book. The air outside darkened briefly as the fighters aligned. For a moment the sky looked like a moving constellation of predatory silhouettes, each one angling its nose toward a singular point, the center mass of the B-17. Then the attacks began. An F-190 came first, diving steeply with sunlight flashing off its canopy. Its cannon rounds stitched upward across the bomber's midsection, tearing fresh holes into the fuselage. Metal sheared in long curls, insulation burst into flame, and fragments cascaded into Smith's compartment like hot gravel. He grit his teeth, pressed his shoulder into the gun mount, and fired. The tracers met the descending fighter. Smith aimed for the engine cowling, a narrow target at that angle, and saw 1.50 caliber round punch through with a puff of black smoke. The fighter jerked left, trailing flame, spinning out of formation before it vanished into the haze. But the kill meant nothing in the next second, because the remaining fighters struck simultaneously. Two Bf-109s swept from the rear, firing in controlled bursts. Cannon shells ripped through the tail structure, blowing out stabilizer supports and sending jagged pieces clattering through the interior. One shell detonated near the floor, jolting Smith into the air before slamming him back down. Pain radiated through his knees, but he forced himself upright with the mechanical consistency of necessity. He pivoted left. Fire exploded closer now, licking the edges of the ammunition crates. Smoke thickened into a choking veil. The oxygen system hissed continuously as ruptured lines vented precious air. The inside of the bomber became an alternating storm of suffocating heat and slicing cold. The smoke stung his eyes, but the cold numbed his fingers, a paradox that made every movement feel half-dreamed, half-mechanical. Then came the hit that should have ended the fight. A belly-mounted cannon burst from a climbing F-190 struck near the radio room, blowing out an entire panel of the fuselage. The explosion threw shards of metal across the waist section, one of them slicing through the fabric near Smith's shoulder and embedding itself into the ammunition chute beside him. Air streamed into the bomber in a violent rush, turning the interior into a wind tunnel that made the fire burn even hotter. The oxygen mask tore partially from his face. The floor felt like it was slanting. His vision blurred. For a moment the world snapped out of focus. He steadied himself against the gun frame, forcing oxygen back through the mask, clearing the fog from his vision. The fire behind him roared again as the increased airflow fed it fresh oxygen. Flames leapt up the wall, brushing dangerously close to the ammunition crates. Rounds inside the boxes began to cook off, each one detonating with sharp, unpredictable snaps that sent fragments bouncing around the compartment. He had no crew left to help. No fire extinguishers within reach. No communication line to the cockpit. The bomber was becoming a sealed furnace, and still he stood at the gun. The next fighter approached low from the right. Smith saw its wings rocking gently, a stabilizing maneuver before firing. The pilot expected no return fire from this side. The bomber's drift had exposed a blind arc. No B-17 was designed to defend. The German fighter positioned perfectly for a kill shot. Smith moved before he thought. He dragged the burning, blistering gun barrel across the frame, ignoring the searing heat radiating through his gloves. He put his entire weight behind the pivot, using the bomber's downward roll to generate momentum. The gun mount slammed into place just as the fighter opened fire. Tracers from the F-190 swept across the window, missing him by inches. Smith fired back at point-blank range. The fighter filled his entire viewport, canopy, wings, nose, everything. His tracers collided with the cockpit area, and the German aircraft snapped violently upward, trailing smoke. It clipped the edge of the bomber's tail, shearing off part of the stabilizer and spinning the fighter into a downward tumble. But the collision tore another hole in the B-17's tail. The aircraft lurched. The fire spilled further across the floor. For the first time, Smith felt the structure beneath him tremble with the unmistakable instability of a plane close to breaking apart. He used the seconds he had left to do the only thing possible, hold the line. He kicked burning debris away from the ammunition, stamping it out with rapid, decisive motions. His boots smoldered at the edges, but he forced the flames down. His lungs burned from heat and smoke. The oxygen mask sucked thin air through a system that barely functioned. The fighters regrouped for a final run, two above, one below, one from the front. Their silhouettes tightened, their movements less cautious now. They believed the bomber was finished, and they weren't wrong. The interior of the Spirit of 76 had become a crucible of fire, cold and metal strain. The aircraft dropped altitude again, engines coughing in uneven rhythm. The wings shuddered visibly. The tail dragged a trail of smoke across the sky, like the final signature of a dying machine. Smith tightened his grip. The breaking point had arrived. The next minute would decide whether he died fighting or the bomber died with him inside. The final attack did not come with the brutal ferocity of the earlier waves. It came instead with a grim inevitability, a slow tightening of the airspace around the Spirit of 76, as if the sky itself were preparing to close the chapter on the crippled bomber. The Luftwaffe fighters circled in widening arcs, looking for confirmation that the aircraft was finally descending toward its end. But something in the angles was wrong. The B-17 was still flying, barely, but flying. The wings shuddered under uneven lift, the tail section drooped like a wounded limb, and the interior burned with a fury that should have hollowed the fuselage. Yet the bomber remained aloft, held together not by engineering resilience alone, but by the relentless will of the man still standing behind the guns. As the fighters began their last coordinated approach, they encountered something they had not expected: sustained, accurate return fire. Smith's tracers cut into their attack lines with the same precision he had shown from the start, despite exhaustion, dehydration, smoke inhalation, and burns now blistering across his back and gloves. His firing discipline had not faltered. The Germans realized they were no longer attacking a vulnerable hulk. They were attacking a wounded animal that still had teeth, and wounded animals are dangerous. The final two fighters broke off, not because they had been shot down, though several had taken damage, but because they saw no need to expend further ammunition on a target that appeared already doomed to crash. Their training emphasized efficiency, not symbolic cruelty. A burning, descending, isolated bomber was considered finished. The Luftwaffe formation turned away in a slow, almost ceremonial curve. Smith watched the silhouettes fade, their outlines shrinking into the haze until the sky became empty again. The silence that settled over the bomber was not victory. It was survival, fragile, temporary, and balanced on the edge of structural collapse. With the fighters gone, the full reality of the bomber's condition became unmistakable. The interior was a wreckage of fire-scorched metal, shredded insulation, and ruptured systems. Bullet holes peppered every surface, frost mixed with soot across the walls. Ammunition lay scattered across the floor like discarded brass teeth. The oxygen lines hissed weakly. The cold returned, mingling with the heat in a disorienting blend that made Smith's skin sting through his flight suit. He looked toward the tail, or what remained of it. The stabilizer was nearly destroyed, hanging at a downward angle that made each moment of flight feel like a negotiation between gravity and determination. Yet through the cracks in the fuselage, he could see daylight, a pale reflection of the world beyond the burned interior. The intercom crackled weakly. For a moment Smith heard nothing but static, then a fractured voice cut through. The pilot, fighting to keep consciousness, murmuring instructions through a system damaged nearly beyond use. The cockpit had suffered massive hits during the engagement. Controls were sticking, gauges failing, and hydraulic lines bleeding pressure like open wounds. But the pilot was alive, and he was trying to guide the bomber home. Smith took stock of the waist section. There was little left to defend, but his work wasn't finished. He turned from the gun, stepping into pools of melted insulation and shattered plexiglass. He began to stamp out any remaining pockets of flame, kicking aside debris still smoldering with chemical heat. His gloves sizzled in some areas where fire licked through the seams. His oxygen was nearly depleted. Every inhale burned, yet he continued, methodically, instinctively, with a clarity forged in the desperation of the previous hour. By the time he had dragged the last piece of burning debris away from the ammunition crates, the bomber had lost considerable altitude. The engines sputtered periodically, their rhythm uneven and jagged. The pilot fought to stabilize the aircraft, leveling out at an altitude low enough to skirt radar and remain within gliding distance of friendly territory. When England finally appeared beneath the clouds, it did not rise like salvation. It emerged slowly, a grey shoreline blurred by fog, as if the land itself could not fully believe the bomber had returned. The landing was brutal. Without functional hydraulics, the pilot had only partial control over the flaps, and almost none over the braking system. The bomber's wheels hit the runway unevenly, bouncing once, twice, then slamming hard enough to send new fractures through the fuselage. The tail struck the ground in a shower of sparks. Metal screamed across concrete. The left engine caught the runway and tore sideways, sending the bomber into a violent spin. When the aircraft finally came to a stop, it sat crooked, half collapsed, and smoking heavily. Emergency crews rushed forward, expecting to find no survivors. Inside, Smith was still standing. The waist gunner, who had been expected to do little more than man a single .50 caliber station, had held off an entire squadron of fighters, extinguished multiple fires, tended to wounded crew members, and preserved the bomber long enough for it to reach friendly soil. His clothing was burned through in several places. His face, blistered and blackened with soot, showed almost no expression. He stepped out of the bomber only when ordered. Days later, after the formal reports were collected and eyewitness accounts verified, the truth of the mission became clear. Smith's actions were not momentary heroism, they were the single thread that prevented the bomber's destruction. For his actions that day, Maynard Snuffy, Smith became the first enlisted airman of the 8th Air Force to receive the Medal of Honor. The citation described unparalleled courage, extraordinary bravery, and heroic disregard for personal safety. But those words could never fully describe the environment he had endured, the furnace of fire, cold, smoke and metal that he had fought within. His legacy became more than a military record, it became a testament to an overlooked truth of combat aviation. Sometimes the course of an entire mission rests on the resolve of one man in one compartment, holding one gun against impossible odds. The wreckage of the Spirit of 76 was salvaged, its story transcribed into brief, efficient paragraphs of wartime reports. But Smith's stand, his endurance in the burning waste section, his precision under pressure, his refusal to yield even as the aircraft broke around him, became one of the defining legends of American bomber history. A single gunner, 12 fighters, one impossible stand, a moment in time carved into the long shadow of a war that demanded everything, and sometimes extraordinarily received it.